A racist white man sees a black couple moving into his neighborhood and thinks that they are suspicious. He begins to spread rumors about the black couple, but he is shocked when he gets a knock on his front door. The late afternoon sun cast a golden hue over the houses on Pine Hill Road. Each home stood tall, immaculate, with perfectly trimmed lawns and clean white fences. Aaron Jackson pulled his sleek black SUV into the driveway of his new home, an elegant two-story house with large windows and a wide front porch. He shut the engine and let out a deep breath. "We did it," he said quietly, glancing at his wife, Elena, who sat beside him, her face glowing with pride. "We really did," she echoed, her voice soft but filled with excitement. They both stepped out of the car, taking in the sight of their new home. It was a big step for them, moving to Northgate, an affluent suburb where houses like theirs symbolized more than just a place to live. It was the result of years of hard work. Aaron stretched his back and looked around the quiet street. Aside from a few cars parked neatly in driveways, the neighborhood was still, peaceful. They were about to unload the first few boxes when a voice called out from across the lawn. "You folks lost or something?" Aaron turned, spotting an older man walking toward them from the house next door. Aaron noticed him glancing from him to Elena, and then to their car, eyebrows slightly raised. "No, sir," Aaron said, keeping his voice steady. "We're right where we're supposed to be." The man stopped a few feet away from them, looking them up and down. Aaron felt the unspoken question hanging in the air, though nothing had been said yet. He met the man's gaze, refusing to flinch. The man smiled thinly. "You sure about that? I didn't hear anything about new folks moving in." Elena, who had been lifting a small box from the trunk, turned around. She wiped her hands on her jeans and walked over to Aaron's side, her voice calm but firm. "Well, you're looking at them now. I'm Elena, and this is my husband, Aaron." The man's eyes flickered with something, surprise maybe, or just discomfort, but he quickly masked it. "George Thompson," he said, offering a curt nod. "I live right next door." Aaron extended his hand, but George didn't seem to notice, or perhaps chose not to. He crossed his arms instead and nodded toward the house. "So, you bought this place?" "That's right," Aaron replied evenly, lowering his hand. "We just moved in today." George looked back at the house, his expression unreadable. "Big house," he muttered, almost to himself. "This neighborhood's quiet, you know. Folks keep to themselves, but we like it that way." Aaron caught the unspoken meaning beneath the words, but didn't bite. "That's good to hear," he said instead. "We're looking forward to some peace and quiet ourselves." George gave a stiff nod, his lips pressing into a thin line. There was an awkward silence before Elena spoke again, trying to smooth the moment. "It's a beautiful neighborhood. We're really excited to be here." George's eyes flicked toward her, and for a moment, his face softened. But then he quickly turned back to Aaron, his gaze hardening again. "Well, I guess I'll see you around then." Aaron smiled politely, looking forward to it. George lingered for a second longer before turning and walking back to his house, his shoulders stiff. Aaron watched him go, feeling the tension still hanging in the air long after George had disappeared inside. He turned to Elena, who was now busying herself with one of the moving boxes, her expression unreadable. "Well," she said, not looking up, "that was something." Aaron shook his head slightly, letting out a breath. "Yeah, something." Elena glanced at him, giving a small shrug. "First day, right?" "First day," Aaron echoed, though his mind lingered on the exchange. He wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but something about George's demeanor bothered him. Still, it was their first day, and he wasn't going to let one awkward encounter spoil the moment. They continued unloading the car, carrying boxes into the house as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The neighborhood remained still and quiet, as if holding its breath, waiting to see how things would unfold. As Aaron carried the last box inside, he glanced back toward George's house. The curtains in the front window were drawn, but for a brief moment, he thought he saw a shadow move behind them, watching. Shaking it off, he stepped inside his new home, closing the door behind him. The Jackson home was bustling with activity. Boxes were scattered around the living room, some half unpacked, others still sealed. Elena was working her way through the kitchen, carefully arranging plates in cabinets, while Aaron straightened a picture frame in the hallway. They'd been busy since the moment they arrived, and yet there was still so much to do. As evening approached, the doorbell rang, breaking the quiet hum of their work. Aaron wiped his hands on a towel and glanced at Elena. "You expecting anyone?" "Nope, probably a neighbor." She gave him a quick smile. "Go make a good first impression." Aaron chuckled as he walked to the door, swinging it open to find a tall, stocky man with salt and pepper hair standing on the porch. His face was friendly, his grin wide and genuine. He was holding a plate covered in foil. "Hey there! You must be the Jacksons," the man said, extending his free hand. "Marcus Lee. I live just down the street." Aaron shook his hand, immediately feeling at ease with Marcus's warm demeanor. "That's us. I'm Aaron. And my wife Elena's inside. Nice to meet you, Marcus. Marcus held up the plate. My wife Shannon made some cookies for you. We like to welcome new folks to the neighborhood with something sweet. That's really kind of you, Aaron said, stepping aside to let him in. Come on in, meet Elena. Elena appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Hi, I'm Elena, she said warmly. Thank you for the cookies. You didn't have to do that. Marcus waved it off. It's no trouble. We were all curious when we saw the moving truck. Northgate doesn't get a lot of new neighbors, so you two are the talk of the block. Elena raised an eyebrow playfully. Hope that's a good thing. Marcus laughed. All good. Mostly people just wondering who the new faces are. In fact, we're having a little get-together at my place tonight. Figured it'd be a great way for you to meet everyone. Aaron glanced at Elena, who gave a small nod. That sounds nice, he said. We could use a break from unpacking. Great! Marcus clapped his hands together. Starts at 7. Just a casual thing. Some drinks, some food, nothing fancy. I'll let you get back to it, but we're looking forward to seeing you both tonight. With another warm handshake and a wave, Marcus left, leaving Aaron and Elena standing in the entryway. Well, Aaron said, turning the plate of cookies over in his hands. Looks like we're diving right into the social scene. Elena smirked. Good. I'm curious to see what the neighborhood's really like. The evening sun was beginning to set as Aaron and Elena walked the short distance to Marcus and Shannon's house. The party was already in full swing when they arrived, the sound of laughter and conversation floating through the open windows. Marcus greeted them at the door, a drink in his hand and a wide smile on his face. Glad you could make it, he said, ushering them inside. The house was warm and inviting, with soft lighting and the smell of food filling the air. In the living room, small groups of neighbors were chatting, holding glasses of wine and beer. Let me introduce you to some folks, Marcus said, leading them over to a cluster of people by the fireplace. This is Susan and Mike. They live a couple houses down from you. And that's Claire over there. She's on the neighborhood association board with me. Susan, a blonde woman in her early 40s, smiled warmly. So nice to meet you both. We've been in Northgate for almost 10 years now. Yeah, we love it here, Mike added. He was a tall, athletic-looking man who seemed like the type to jog every morning. You'll find it's a great place to live. Quiet, safe. Elena nodded politely. It seems like a wonderful neighborhood. We're looking forward to settling in. Susan tilted her head slightly, her smile never faltering. What do you both do? Must have pretty good jobs to afford a place in Northgate. Aaron exchanged a quick glance with Elena, recognizing the question for what it was. He kept his voice light as he answered, I'm an investment banker, and Elena runs her own interior design business. Mike let out a low whistle. Investment banker, huh? That explains it. Tough field to break into. Yeah, it's competitive, Aaron said. But we've worked hard to get where we are. Susan nodded approvingly. That's great. It's always nice to see new people who appreciate what Northgate has to offer. As they continued to mingle, Aaron couldn't help but notice a few curious glances from other guests, as though some of them were sizing him and Elena up. It was subtle, nothing anyone would say out loud, but it was there, woven into the fabric of the polite conversations. The questions about their jobs, their backgrounds, always delivered with a smile, but with an undercurrent of surprise. Elena, ever the observant one, leaned over and whispered to Aaron during a lull in the conversation. You feel it too, right? Yeah, Aaron murmured back, keeping his face neutral. Nothing too bad, though, just curiosity. Before Elena could respond, Marcus reappeared, pulling them into another conversation, this time with Claire, who was eager to talk about the neighborhood association and the upcoming block party. We always like to get everyone involved, Claire said brightly. I'll have to make sure you're on the mailing list for the next meeting. We could always use fresh ideas. That sounds great, Elena replied, her tone genuine. We'd love to be involved. The evening wore on, and as the sun fully set, the mood of the party became more relaxed. Aaron and Elena found themselves chatting with more neighbors, sharing laughs and stories. By the end of the night, any initial awkwardness had faded, and they were feeling cautiously optimistic about fitting into Northgate. But as they walked back to their house, hand in hand, Aaron couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced back toward George Thompson's house. The lights were off, the windows dark, but Aaron thought he saw the faintest flicker of movement behind the curtains. He looked away, focusing on the warm glow of their own front porch. How do you think it went? He asked Elena. She smiled softly. I think we're going to be just fine here. Some people might need a little more time, but that's okay. We've got all the time in the world. Aaron nodded, his gaze lingering for just a moment longer on George's darkened windows before he followed Elena inside. It had been 2 weeks since the Jacksons moved in, and life was finally beginning to settle into a comfortable routine. Aaron and Elena had made a few friends from the neighborhood, and each day felt a little less like they were the new people in town. Elena had just finished hanging the last picture in their living room when Aaron walked in from the garage, wiping his hands on a towel. "You done already?" he asked, glancing around at the now decorated room. Elena smiled. "You know me. Can't live with blank walls for too long." Aaron chuckled, looking around at the warm, inviting space they had created. Their home finally felt like home. He was about to say something when he noticed Elena's phone buzzing on the coffee table. "Someone's popular," he teased, picking it up and handing it to her. Elena glanced at the screen and grinned. "It's Shannon, Marcus's wife. She wants me to come over tomorrow for some kind of neighborhood brunch." "Sounds fun," Aaron said. "Marcus mentioned something about that. Said the neighborhood ladies do it once a month. Yeah, should be nice to meet more people." Elena typed a quick response and set her phone back down. "How was your day?" Aaron shrugged. "Work was good. Marcus dropped by the office for lunch. He's a good guy. Said he's been keeping an ear out for us." Elena raised an eyebrow. "Keeping an ear out?" Aaron sighed, sinking into the couch. "Apparently George has been talking." Elena frowned, sitting down beside him. "Talking how?" "Marcus didn't get too specific, but it sounds like George has been spreading rumors. Asking questions like how we can afford the house. Stuff like that." Elena's frown deepened. "Seriously? After that awkward introduction, I thought he'd at least let it go." Aaron shook his head. "It doesn't seem like it. He's been talking to some of the older folks, the ones who've been here forever. Marcus says not everyone's buying into it, but still, it's out there." Elena was quiet for a moment, processing the information. "So, what do we do?" "We keep doing what we've been doing," Aaron said, his voice steady. "We're not going to let one bitter guy ruin this for us. People will see the truth." Elena nodded, though the tension in her face hadn't eased. "Yeah, you're right." The next day, Elena arrived at Shannon's house for the neighborhood brunch. The smell of freshly baked scones and brewing coffee filled the air as she walked into the kitchen, where a small group of women were chatting and laughing. "Elena," Shannon called out from across the room. "So glad you could make it." "Wouldn't miss it," Elena replied with a smile, making her way over. Shannon handed her a mug of coffee, and soon they were surrounded by other neighbors, all eager to chat. For the most part, the conversation was light and pleasant, talk of gardening, kids, and weekend plans. But Elena couldn't help but notice a few sideways glances from two women standing near the counter. They hadn't introduced themselves, and while they hadn't been rude, there was something about their body language that felt off. "Is it true?" one of them asked suddenly, her voice loud enough to cut through the light chatter. Elena turned, slightly confused. "Sorry, what's true?" The woman, a tall redhead in her 50s, gave a small, tight smile. "That your husband's in finance? That must be how you guys got that place." Elena blinked, caught off guard by the bluntness of the question. "Yes, he's an investment banker." The redhead raised an eyebrow. "That's impressive. And you? What do you do again?" "I'm an interior designer," Elena said, keeping her tone even. "Interior design," the woman repeated, her tone carrying a hint of disbelief. "That must be doing pretty well too, huh?" Elena could feel the weight of their gazes on her. She smiled politely. "We've both worked hard to get to where we are." The other woman, who had remained quiet until now, finally spoke. "I just heard, well, George mentioned something the other day. He said it was odd, for new people to move in so fast. He wondered, how someone could afford a place like that without anyone knowing." Elena stiffened, but before she could respond, Shannon quickly interjected. "Oh, come on, Beth. Who cares how they got the house? They're our neighbors now, and that's what matters." Beth shrugged. "I'm just saying what I heard." Elena smiled tightly, feeling the sting of the insinuation. "Well, like I said, we've worked hard for everything we have." Shannon gave Elena a sympathetic glance before changing the subject, steering the conversation back to lighter topics. But the damage had been done. Elena spent the rest of the brunch feeling the weight of the rumors, unsure of how many of the other women had already heard George's whispers. Later that evening, back at home, Elena relayed the brunch conversation to Aaron. He listened quietly, his expression darkening with every word. "So, it's not just rumors anymore," he said finally. "He's making sure people doubt us." Elena nodded. It was clear. Some of them have already started buying into his story. Aaron sighed, rubbing his temples. "I figured he'd keep it quiet, just talking to a few people here and there. But if he's this open about it..." "What do we do?" Elena asked, her voice tense. "We stay calm," Aaron said, though the frustration was clear in his voice. "People like George feed off reactions. If we get upset, we play right into his hands. We just need to keep doing what we're doing. Let our actions speak for themselves." Elena nodded, though she still looked unsettled. "It just feels like no matter what we do, there's going to be people who believe him." "There might be," Aaron admitted, "but there will also be people who see through it. Marcus is on our side, and so are a lot of the others. The ones that matter will come around." Elena sighed and leaned against him. I hope so. Aaron wrapped an arm around her, pulling her close. We'll be okay, Elena. George can talk all he wants, but we're not going anywhere. They sat there in the quiet of their living room, the faint sounds of the neighborhood outside. But now, even in the stillness, the air felt different, thicker, charged with the weight of unspoken words and growing tensions. Aaron glanced toward the window, his thoughts lingering on George's house next door. The man was clearly set on making them feel unwelcome, but Aaron wasn't about to let him win. Not here, not in their home. Aaron was finishing up some work emails when his phone buzzed. He glanced down at the screen. Marcus. Aaron picked up, leaning back in his chair. Hey, Marcus, what's up? Aaron, I don't want to bother you, but I thought you should know. George is at it again. Aaron's jaw tightened. What's he saying now? More of the same. He's been talking to the older folks, the ones who've lived here forever, about how he thinks it's suspicious that you and Elena bought the house so quickly. He's implying that you two couldn't have afforded it on your own. Aaron's grip on his phone tightened, but he kept his voice level. Of course he is. Anything else? Marcus sighed on the other end of the line. Yeah, he's also saying you're going to bring the neighborhood down, that things are going to change around here because you don't belong. Aaron was silent for a moment, the anger rising in his chest. I appreciate you telling me, Marcus. It's getting old. I know, man. Most of us aren't listening to him, but some people are. And I just wanted you to be aware. Thanks, Aaron said quietly. I'll handle it. After hanging up, Aaron sat in silence for a moment, the tension in his body growing. It wasn't just the rumors. He could handle those, but the constant whispering behind their backs, the little looks of suspicion from some of the neighbors. It was wearing on him. George's behavior was a festering wound, and Aaron knew it was time to confront him. The evening sky was darkening when Aaron walked across the lawn to George's house. He was done letting this drag on. As he approached, he noticed George's car in the driveway and the faint glow of light coming from the living room window. Aaron knocked firmly on the door. It took a few moments, but eventually, the door swung open. George stood there, his face impassive. He looked Aaron up and down, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. Aaron, George said, his voice flat. What brings you here? We need to talk, Aaron said, his voice calm but firm. I've been hearing things, George. Things you've been saying about me and my wife. George didn't move, his expression unchanged. I don't know what you're talking about. Aaron clenched his fists but kept his tone controlled. Don't play dumb. You've been spreading rumors, telling people we don't belong here, that we can't afford this house. I'm giving you a chance to say whatever it is you need to say, to my face. George stepped back slightly, but his face twisted in a sneer. I don't need to explain myself to you, Aaron. I'm just looking out for this neighborhood. You might think you've earned your place here, but people like you always come in and change things. It's not about you personally. It's about keeping things the way they should be. Aaron's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. People like me? What exactly do you mean by that, George? George crossed his arms over his chest, his voice dropping. You know exactly what I mean. There it was. The mask was off, and Aaron felt a flare of anger surge in his chest. But he wouldn't give George the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. You're wrong, Aaron said, his voice quiet but firm. We do belong here. Just because we're different from you doesn't mean we're any less deserving of this home, this life. We've worked hard for everything we have, and we're not going anywhere. George let out a short, bitter laugh. Worked hard? You think that's all it takes? You have no idea what it means to protect a place like this. Aaron stepped closer, his eyes locked on George's. What are you protecting, George? Some outdated idea of what this neighborhood should look like. This place isn't yours to gatekeep. You're clinging to something that doesn't exist anymore, and you know it. That's why you're so angry. George's face flushed, his mouth tightening into a hard line. He didn't respond immediately, but the tension between them was palpable. Aaron took a step back, shaking his head slightly. I'm done with the whispers and the rumors. You can keep talking if you want, but it won't change anything. We're not leaving. We're not going to let you make us feel unwelcome in our own home. George stood there, his fists clenched at his sides. For a moment, Aaron thought he might say something. Lash out, maybe. But instead, George just glared at him, his eyes burning with resentment. Without another word, Aaron turned and walked away, his heart pounding in his chest. As he crossed the lawn back to his house, he felt a mix of anger and relief. He'd said what needed to be said. George could keep his bitterness, but Aaron wasn't going to let it consume him or Elena. Later that night, Aaron sat on the couch, staring out the window at George's darkened house. Elena was beside him, reading a book, though her attention drifted as she sensed his mood. You talked to him, didn't you? She asked softly, not looking up from the page. Aaron nodded. Yeah, it went about as well as I expected. Elena sighed, setting the book down. And nothing. Aaron said. He's not going to change. He's too stuck in his ways. Elena looked at him, her expression softening. So what now? Now, we keep living our lives. Let him stew in his bitterness if he wants to. It's not our problem anymore. Elena smiled gently. You did the right thing, Aaron. He needed to hear it. Aaron nodded, though the frustration still simmered beneath the surface. I just want this to be over, Elena. I don't want to keep fighting this silent war with him. We won't have to, Elena said quietly. People like George always expose themselves in the end. They can't hide forever. Aaron leaned back, letting her words sink in. He knew she was right. George's bitterness, his refusal to accept change, would eventually isolate him. But in the meantime, they had a life to live, a home to build, and a community to grow in. Aaron glanced at Elena, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. We're going to be okay, he said softly. Elena nodded, her eyes warm. We already are. They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the confrontation lifting as the night settled around them. Aaron knew there would be more challenges ahead, but tonight, they had won a small victory. And that was enough for now. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity for the Jacksons. Aaron and Elena became more involved in the life of the neighborhood, each step forward a subtle, quiet rebuttal to George's efforts to make them feel unwelcome. The rumors had continued to float around, but more and more the couple found themselves embraced by the very community George had tried to turn against them. One Saturday afternoon, Aaron stood at the end of his driveway, chatting with Marcus, as they planned for the upcoming neighborhood watch meeting. The warm summer air was filled with the sounds of kids playing down the street and the low hum of lawnmowers in the distance. You've really been doing great things with the neighborhood watch, Marcus said, clapping Aaron on the shoulder. We've had more participation since you joined. Aaron smiled. Glad to be a part of it. It's been a good way to get to know more people. Marcus chuckled. Well, people are noticing. It's good to have someone with your energy involved. As they continued talking, Aaron noticed George standing in his front yard, staring at them. The older man hadn't spoken to Aaron since their confrontation weeks ago, and each time they crossed paths, George's expression grew darker. He didn't say anything now, just glared before turning and heading back inside his house. Marcus followed Aaron's gaze, his smile fading slightly. He's still giving you trouble? Not directly, Aaron said, shrugging. But he's not happy seeing us around, that's for sure. Marcus shook his head. He'll get over it, or he won't. But the rest of us? We're glad you're here, Aaron. Don't let him get in your head. Aaron nodded, appreciating Marcus's words. Thanks. I'm not too worried. Elena and we're just focused on settling in. And you're doing a damn good job of it, Marcus said, giving him a final pat on the shoulder before heading off down the street. Inside, Elena was busy preparing for a small design workshop she'd been asked to host for a few of the neighborhood women. Shannon had helped her organize it after Elena's interior design work became the talk of one of the brunches. Elena had agreed to the idea, knowing it was a good way to showcase her skills and integrate further into the community. As she set out fabric swatches and color samples, the doorbell rang, and soon Shannon, Susan, and two other women from the neighborhood were standing in the living room, admiring the space. Elena, this is gorgeous, Shannon said, running her hand over the smooth edge of the dining room table. You have such a great eye for design. Thank you, Elena said, smiling warmly. I've been doing this for a while, but it's always fun to share ideas with other people. Susan, who had been more distant during their first few encounters, was more engaged now, walking around the room and asking questions about different pieces of decor. You picked all of this out yourself? Susan asked, her tone genuinely curious. Elena nodded. Most of it, yes. I like to mix styles, modern with a few traditional elements to keep things balanced. Well, you certainly have a talent for it, Susan said, offering a small smile. I could never make a room look this good. Elena laughed lightly. I'm sure you could. It's all about finding what speaks to you. As the women gathered around the table, chatting and going over design tips, Elena couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. The lingering tension she had felt during that first brunch was gone now, replaced by a more genuine warmth from the women. Even Susan, who had initially seemed skeptical, was now leaning in, asking for advice about her own home. By the end of the workshop, Shannon pulled Elena aside. I told you this would be great, she said with a grin. Everyone's talking about how much they learned. You've really made an impression. Elena smiled, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. I'm just glad people enjoyed it. They more than enjoyed it, Shannon said. You've become an important part of this neighborhood, Elena. People are starting to look up to you. Elena blinked in surprise. I'm just trying to help out where I can. Well, you're doing a lot more than that, Shannon said, her tone sincere. Don't be surprised if people start coming to you for more advice, or if you get a few more invitations to events. As Shannon and the other women left, Elena sat down on the couch, taking a moment to let the day sink in. She had been so focused on simply surviving the undercurrents of suspicion that she hadn't realized just how much ground she and Aaron had gained. That evening, as they ate dinner, Aaron brought up the workshop. How'd it go with the design group? Elena smiled. It went really well, actually. Everyone seemed to love it. Even Susan. Susan? Aaron raised an eyebrow. That's progress. I know, Elena said, laughing softly. She even asked for advice on her living room. I think we've finally turned a corner. Aaron nodded, feeling a sense of pride for Elena. That's great. You're winning them over, one room at a time. Looks like it, Elena said. She paused for a moment, her expression growing more thoughtful. You know, it's kind of strange. What is? Just how things are changing. I mean, I know George is still there, still probably telling his stories, but it feels like no one's really listening anymore. Not like they were in the beginning. Aaron leaned back in his chair, considering her words. I think you're right. People are starting to see us for who we are, not what George thinks we are. Elena nodded, her smile returning. I didn't expect it to happen so soon. Me neither, Aaron admitted. But it's a good feeling, isn't it? Elena reached across the table, taking his hand. It really is. The next weekend, there was a neighborhood block party. The entire street was lined with tables of food, kids running around with balloons, and neighbors mingling. Aaron and Elena spent the afternoon chatting with people they had gotten to know over the past month. Marcus, Shannon, Susan, and others. The atmosphere was relaxed and friendly, and for the first time since moving to Northgate, Aaron felt like they truly belonged. At one point, Aaron saw George standing at the edge of the gathering, watching from his porch. His arms were crossed, his face set in a hard scowl. Aaron caught his eye, but George quickly turned away, retreating back into his house. Aaron watched him go, feeling a pang of pity for the man. While the rest of the neighborhood was coming together, George seemed more isolated than ever. Don't worry about him, Marcus said, appearing at Aaron's side. He's made his bed. I know, Aaron said quietly. It's just sad, I guess. It is, Marcus agreed. But people like him? They can't handle change. The neighborhood's moving forward, with or without him. Aaron nodded, his eyes still on George's house. Yeah, I guess you're right. Marcus clapped him on the shoulder. Come on, let's grab a drink. As Aaron and Marcus walked back toward the crowd, Aaron realized that for the first time in a long while, he felt at peace. The tension that had been hanging over them since the day they moved in was lifting, replaced by the warmth of a community that was slowly but surely embracing them. They had come to Northgate to build a life, and now it finally felt like they were doing just that. It was a warm, late summer afternoon, and the residents of Northgate had gathered for the neighborhood association meeting at Marcus Lee's house. Aaron and Elena arrived early, as they had become more involved in the community's events over the past few months. Elena brought a homemade fruit tart, which quickly became a hit among the neighbors. People mingled, chatting easily in small groups as they waited for the meeting to start. Aaron stood by the kitchen island, talking to Marcus and another neighbor, when he noticed George walking in through the door. George hadn't attended any neighborhood gatherings in a while, and his presence immediately shifted the atmosphere in the room. Conversations quieted, and a few people shot uneasy glances in George's direction as he took a seat in the corner, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. Elena caught Aaron's eye and raised an eyebrow. Aaron gave a small shrug, not sure what to expect. George's tension was palpable, his face set in a grim expression, as if he were bracing for something. Aaron felt a knot tighten in his stomach, sensing that George was holding something back, something that was about to boil over. The meeting began with Marcus going over some routine matters, the upcoming block party, neighborhood security updates, and plans for a new park nearby. The mood seemed to lighten as the discussions turned to more positive topics. Aaron and Elena exchanged smiles with some of the other neighbors, feeling more at ease with each passing moment. But then, as Marcus wrapped up the meeting, George suddenly stood up from his chair. The room went silent. He looked around, his face flushed, his jaw clenched. I've got something to say, George announced, his voice louder than it needed to be. He took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he swept them over the group. Marcus looked taken aback but remained calm. Go ahead, George. What's on your mind? George's gaze landed squarely on Aaron and Elena, and Aaron felt the tension in his body rise. He had a sinking feeling that whatever George was about to say wasn't going to be good. What's on my mind? George began, his voice dripping with bitterness. Is this neighborhood what it's becoming? I've lived here for over 20 years, and I've seen a lot of changes, but none like this. There were murmurs in the room, and a few people exchanged uncomfortable glances. Aaron remained silent, his eyes locked on George, waiting. George continued, his voice rising. I've worked hard my entire life to keep this neighborhood the way it should be, a place where people know each other, where we take care of our homes and respect our community. But now it's changing, and not for the better. Elena stiffened beside Aaron, but she said nothing, keeping her gaze steady on George. George's voice took on a harsh, almost desperate edge. People like the Jacksons, he spat their name. They come in, and everything starts to shift. You've all been too blind to see it, but I've been watching. They don't belong here. They don't understand what this neighborhood is about. And if we let this continue, things are going to fall apart. Mark my words. The room was dead silent for a moment. The weight of George's words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Aaron felt a rush of heat rise in his chest, but he kept his composure, refusing to let George's venomous speech get to him. He could see several of the neighbors were visibly uncomfortable, but no one said anything right away. Finally, Marcus spoke up, his tone calm but firm. George, you're out of line. George turned on Marcus, his face reddening further. Am I? Am I really? You think this neighborhood's better off with people like them here? They don't fit in, Marcus. You can't just pretend everything's fine. Marcus shook his head slowly. No, George, you're the one who doesn't fit in anymore. There was a murmur of agreement from several people in the room, and George's face twisted in disbelief. He looked around, his eyes wild as if he couldn't comprehend what he was hearing. What? You're all just going to stand by and let this happen? You think they belong here? George's voice cracked, his frustration pouring out unchecked. I've been trying to protect this neighborhood, and this is how you repay me? By letting them waltz in and take over? Susan, one of the women who had attended Elena's design workshop, spoke up from the back of the room. George, they're good people. They've been nothing but kind and respectful since they moved here. You're the only one who seems to have a problem with them. George glared at her, his fists clenching at his sides. You don't understand. None of you do. They're going to change everything. This place won't be the same anymore. Aaron finally stood, his voice calm but carrying a weight of finality. George, you're the one who's changed. This neighborhood isn't yours to control. It belongs to all of us, and we're not going anywhere. You're the only one who can't seem to accept that. George's face twisted with rage, his whole body trembling with the effort to hold himself together. For a moment, Aaron thought George might actually lash out, but instead, George just stood there, breathing heavily, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for someone to agree with him, but no one did. The silence was thick and suffocating, and in that moment, it was clear that George was completely and utterly alone. He had pushed too far, and the neighborhood had finally had enough. Marcus took a step forward, his voice calm, but authoritative. George, I think it's time for you to go. For a long moment, George just stood there, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. Then, without another word, he turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The room remained quiet for several seconds after he left. No one quite knew what to say. Finally, Marcus broke the silence, his voice steady. I'm sorry about that, everyone. I think we've heard the last of George. There were murmurs of agreement and nods from around the room. The tension began to lift, and slowly, the conversations resumed, though quieter and more subdued than before. Aaron and Elena stayed for a little while longer, talking with some of the neighbors who offered their support, and reassured them that George's outburst didn't reflect the feelings of the community. But eventually, they made their way back home, the weight of the evening settling in. Later that night, as Aaron and Elena sat on their porch, watching the quiet street, Elena finally spoke. I didn't expect him to lose it like that. Neither did I, Aaron said, leaning back in his chair. But I guess it was only a matter of time. Elena sighed softly. Do you think it's really over? Aaron nodded. Yeah, he burned every bridge tonight. There's no coming back from that. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then she reached over and took Aaron's hand. We're going to be okay, aren't we? Aaron smiled, squeezing her hand gently. We already are. They sat together in the stillness of the night, the sound of crickets filling the air. The storm had passed, and for the first time in a long while, the future felt peaceful. The neighborhood felt different after George's outburst. It was as though a cloud had lifted, and the tension that had been quietly building for months finally dissipated. For the Jacksons, life in Northgate became even more comfortable as they continued to thrive. But for George, the aftermath of his public meltdown was isolation, and it was becoming painfully obvious to everyone. A few days after the neighborhood association meeting, Aaron and Elena were sitting in their backyard, enjoying the early morning sun. The soft chirping of birds filled the air, and the garden they had worked so hard on was blooming with bright flowers and vibrant greenery. Elena looked up from her coffee. You haven't seen George around, have you? Aaron shook his head, his gaze wandering over to George's house. Nope, he's been keeping to himself. Not that I'm surprised. He must be feeling the fallout from that meeting, Elena said thoughtfully. It's hard to come back from something like that. Aaron leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. It's what he deserves. He tried to make us feel like we didn't belong here, and now it's him who's on the outside. Elena nodded, but didn't say anything more. She understood that while George had brought this on himself, there was something inherently sad about watching someone isolate themselves. But after everything he had put them through, she didn't have much sympathy left. The days turned into weeks, and George's absence from the neighborhood became even more noticeable. Aaron and Elena heard bits and pieces from Marcus and some of the other neighbors. George had stopped attending community events entirely, and it seemed as though even his wife Barbara had grown tired of his bitterness. One evening, as Aaron and Elena were coming back from a walk, they saw Barbara standing alone in her front yard, trimming the hedges. She looked tired, her face drawn with the weight of unspoken frustration. Aaron hesitated, then nodded politely to her. "Evening, Barbara," he said, keeping his tone neutral but friendly. Barbara looked up, startled at first, then offered a small, weary smile. "Evening, Aaron." Elena. Elena smiled gently. "How are you doing?" Barbara sighed and put down her clippers. "I'm managing. It's been a rough few weeks." Aaron glanced over at George's house, where the curtains were tightly drawn, giving the place a cold, closed-off feel. "I can imagine." Barbara followed his gaze, her expression tightening. "George hasn't been himself lately. Well, not for a long time, if I'm being honest." Elena stepped closer, her voice soft but concerned. "I hope you're okay, Barbara. We don't see you around much anymore." Barbara shrugged, looking down at the ground. "It's hard. After what happened at the meeting, no one really wants anything to do with us. I don't blame them, though." There was a long pause before she continued. "George can't let things go. He's still so angry. Angry at you. Angry at the neighborhood. Angry at the world, I suppose. But I'm tired too. I don't know how much longer I can keep going like this." Elena shared a glance with Aaron, unsure of how to respond. The bitterness George had sown had spread even into his own home, and it was clear Barbara was struggling to hold everything together. "If there's anything we can do to help, Barbara, let us know," Elena said gently. "No one should have to deal with that alone." Barbara smiled weakly, her eyes softening for a moment. "Thank you, Elena. I appreciate that. I really do. But I think this is something George has to face on his own." She paused, glancing back at her house. "We've been talking about moving. Things haven't been the same since that night. No one wants to talk to him, and honestly, I can't live like this anymore." Aaron and Elena stood there, not knowing what to say. Barbara's pain was clear, and while they had no sympathy left for George, they could feel the toll his behavior had taken on her. Barbara offered them one last tired smile before turning back to her hedges. "Well, I better get back to this. You two take care." Aaron and Elena walked away, the weight of the conversation settling over them like a heavy blanket. As they headed back into their own home, Elena shook her head. "I feel bad for her," she said quietly. "But at the same time, it's hard to feel too sorry for them after everything George did." Aaron nodded in agreement. "Yeah, he's paying the price for his actions now. The neighborhood's made it clear they won't tolerate his behavior, and I think Barbara's starting to realize she doesn't have to either." Over the next few weeks, it became evident that Barbara's decision had been made. A "for sale" sign appeared on George's front lawn, and it didn't take long for the news to spread. The Thompsons were moving out. Word trickled down from neighbors that George had finally been convinced to sell the house, though it was clear the decision had been Barbara's more than his. Aaron and Elena watched the process unfold with a quiet sense of closure. They had endured months of George's hostility and rumors, but now, the person who had tried to make them feel like outsiders was the one being driven out by his own actions. One afternoon, as Aaron worked in the yard, he noticed the moving trucks pulling up next door. He saw Barbara directing the movers, packing up furniture, boxes, and the remnants of a life that had once seemed so firmly rooted in Northgate. Elena joined Aaron outside, watching quietly as the movers worked. "I guess this is it, huh?" "Looks like it," Aaron said, his voice calm but reflective. "I didn't expect it to happen so soon." Elena nodded. "Barbara must have really pushed for it. I think she's done." Aaron watched as Barbara gave one last glance toward their house before disappearing inside. There was no sign of George. He hadn't been seen in days, and Aaron wondered if he had retreated completely, unwilling to face the reality of what was happening. That evening, as the last of the moving trucks pulled away and the house next door sat empty, Aaron and Elena stood on their porch, reflecting on everything that had happened. "It's strange, isn't it?" Elena said softly. "How things turned out." "Yeah," Aaron agreed. "We came here hoping for a fresh start, and we got one, but it wasn't the way we expected." Elena looked over at the empty house next door. "I wonder if George ever realized how much he hurt himself in the process. He wanted to drive us out, but he's the one who couldn't stay." Aaron shook his head. "Some people can't see past their own hate. He dug himself into a hole and couldn't find his way out." They stood in silence for a few moments. the weight of the months that had passed settling over them. The battle they had faced with George was finally over, and while there was a sense of relief, there was also a quiet sadness at how it had ended. Elena leaned into Aaron, resting her head on his shoulder. "I'm glad we stayed, Aaron. I'm glad we didn't let him push us out." Aaron wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Me too, Elena. Me too." As the sun set behind the trees and the quiet of the neighborhood settled in, Aaron and Elena felt a sense of peace wash over them. The conflict was behind them now, and the future, once uncertain, felt brighter. A month had passed since the Thompsons moved out. The for sale sign had long been replaced with a sold one, and the house sat quietly, waiting for its new owners to arrive. Northgate had returned to its usual rhythm. Aaron and Elena were more settled than ever, and their involvement in the community continued to grow. The neighborhood seemed at peace, the tension of George's presence now a distant memory. It was a crisp autumn afternoon. The trees lining Pine Hill Road had begun to change color, their leaves fluttering down to cover the sidewalks. Aaron was raking the front yard, enjoying the quiet hum of the neighborhood. Elena was inside, rearranging some furniture in the living room, her soft humming carrying through the open windows. As Aaron worked, he noticed a figure standing at the end of the street, slowly making its way toward George's old house. At first, he didn't recognize the man. He was thinner, his shoulders slumped, his steps heavy. But as the man got closer, Aaron's stomach tightened. It was George. George stopped at the end of the driveway, staring at the house as if seeing it for the first time. He looked older, more worn down than Aaron remembered. His face was gaunt, his clothes rumpled, and there was a hollowness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He stood there, unmoving, staring at the house in silence. Aaron straightened up, leaning on the rake, watching him from a distance. For a moment, neither man spoke. The quiet between them was thick, filled with the weight of everything that had happened. Then, suddenly, George's eyes flicked to Aaron, and his face twisted in anger. He took a few steps toward the yard, his fists clenched at his sides. "You!" George spat, his voice low and filled with venom. "You ruined everything!" Aaron didn't move, his expression calm but alert. "George, what are you doing here?" George took another step forward, his voice rising. "You think you're so great, don't you? You and your wife waltzing in here, acting like you belong. You don't. You never did." Aaron sighed, the calm in his voice unwavering. "George, this isn't your home anymore. You need to let this go." George's face reddened, his eyes wild with anger and desperation. "Let it go? You destroyed my life. I had everything here. Respect. A place where people listened to me. And now I've got nothing. Nothing. And it's all because of you." Aaron shook his head slowly. "It's not because of me, George. It's because of you." George's eyes widened in disbelief, his fist shaking as he pointed at Aaron. "Don't you dare put this on me. I had this neighborhood under control before you showed up. You came in here and everything changed. Everyone turned on me." Aaron took a slow step forward, meeting George's gaze with calm, steady eyes. "They didn't turn on you because of me, George. They turned on you because of what you became." George's face twisted with rage, but he didn't speak, his chest heaving with labored breaths. Aaron's voice remained even, but there was a firmness to it that cut through the tension. "You did this to yourself. You pushed everyone away with your hate, your bitterness. You tried to tear us down, but the only person you ruined was yourself." George's eyes darted around, as if looking for someone, anyone, to agree with him. But there was no one, just the two of them, standing in the empty street. "You wanted to protect this place," Aaron continued. "But the truth is, you were protecting your own small-mindedness. Your racism is what ruined your life, not us." George's face fell for a moment, the fight in him flickering out briefly. But it wasn't long before the anger returned, though weaker now, more hollow. "You don't know anything about me," George muttered, though his voice lacked the fire it had before. "You've never lived a life like mine." Aaron nodded slowly, his gaze softening just slightly. "You're right, George. I haven't lived your life, but that doesn't excuse what you did. You made a choice. You chose to hate us because we didn't look like you. And now you're standing here trying to blame me for the consequences of your choices." George's face tightened, his jaw clenching, but he didn't respond. He just stood there, staring at Aaron, his eyes flickering with a mix of anger and something else, something like defeat. Aaron lowered the rake, his voice quiet but firm. "This isn't about you and me anymore, George. You're not going to get your life back by coming here and trying to blame us. This place moved on. It's time you do the same." For a moment, George looked like he might say something, but then his shoulders slumped. The fight seemed to drain out of him completely, leaving him standing there, hollow and defeated. He glanced back at the house, his old home, now empty and waiting for someone new to fill it. Aaron watched as George stood in silence, his eyes clouded with thoughts Aaron couldn't begin to imagine. Then, without another word, George turned and walked away, his steps slow and heavy, like a man carrying the weight of his own mistakes on his back. Aaron stood there for a long time after George disappeared down the street, the wind rustling the leaves around him. He felt no triumph in George's defeat, no satisfaction in seeing the man brought low by his own hatred. It was just sad, a reminder of what bitterness could do when it was allowed to fester and grow unchecked. Elena came out of the house a few minutes later, holding a mug of tea. She saw Aaron standing at the end of the yard and walked over to him, handing him the mug. "Everything okay?" Aaron took the mug and nodded. "Yeah, George came by. He's not doing well." Elena frowned, glancing down the street. "What did he want?" Aaron sighed, taking a sip of the tea. "To blame us for everything that's gone wrong in his life. But I told him the truth. His own hate ruined him, not us." Elena looked at him for a moment, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think he'll ever understand that?" Aaron shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe, maybe not." They stood there together, watching the quiet street as the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of autumn leaves. For the first time in months, the world around them felt calm, settled. "We're going to be okay," Elena said softly, leaning into Aaron. Aaron wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. "Yeah, we already are." As the evening light faded and the streetlights flickered on, Aaron and Elena turned and walked back into their home, closing the door behind them. Whatever challenges they had faced, whatever trials they had endured, they had made it through, together, and that was enough.